Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you 3 must-know checkmates all in one video. Get these checkmates down by heart and you'll see your rating start to skyrocket in no time at all. So to kick it off, we'll dive straight into the rook and king checkmate. In today's video we're going to look at checkmating the king using king and rook only. So I wanted to start with the position here that we're actually trying to reach to deliver the checkmate. So we can see that the white king is opposite the black king, and the black king has been forced to the edge of the board here. Forcing the king to the edge of the board is a key concept in delivering this checkmate, because we have to deliver the checkmate along one of these edges here using the rook. So now that white has forced the black king to the edge of the board and is directly opposite the king, we can now deliver the checkmate using the rook on a7. So white now plays the rook from a7 to a8, where it checks the black king from the side, and it therefore stops the black king from moving left or right, and the king, the white king which is in front of the black king, is stopping the black king from coming up the board to either of these 3 squares. So as we can see, the king is boxed in, and that's checkmate. So now that we've had a look at the final checkmating position, let's take a look at how we actually get to that. So the first thing to say is that we need to use our rook to cut off the king's space. So in this position, it's white to move. The black king is on e5 here. And as said, we want to drive the black king to one of the 4 edges of the board. Now, you can drive the black king to any one of those 4 edges. Which one you drive it to really depends on the position of the black king. So if the black king was way over here on g5, for example, then it would be very logical to start trying to drive the king to the h-file in order to deliver the checkmate here. Because the king is on e5, we can see that it's in this half of the board. If I just quickly draw some arrows around that. And so therefore it makes sense to start driving the king towards this edge of the board. So to do that, we can now play the rook up from c2 into this c4 square. And suddenly the rook is now looking left and right along this rank. And therefore we're cutting the king from proceeding towards this side of the board. It's now black to move, and the most logical move for black here is to move away from the white king and towards the white rook, therefore attacking it. Now as said, we've just moved the rook up to the 4th rank here because we want to cut off this space and start driving the king backwards down the board. So it wouldn't now make sense to play a retreating move with the rook, let's say for example to c1, because then the black king can start advancing down the board and we haven't actually made progress. So if I run it back here, the way in which we want to play is move the rook away from the black king and keep it on the same rank. So the most logical move for white here is to move the rook to the right hand side, the long side of the board, because then the rook is far away from the black king and it can't be pestered again by the king and attacked. If black were to now follow the rook, then the move is now handed back to white and white needs to consider what to do. So we know that we want to get the white king opposite the black king. However, if we were to do this straight away, then we have a problem, because it's now black to move, and the moment that black moves left or right, let's move left by 1 square in this position, suddenly we're no longer opposite the black king, and if we try to give this check with the rook, the black king can escape down the board. So the only way we can ever check the black king and force it backwards down the board is if the kings are opposite each other. So this is a really important concept to remember. The kings have to be opposite each other for the white rook to then deliver the check and force the king backwards down the board, or deliver checkmate if it's already on the very back edge. So if we run it back a move, in this position here, it doesn't make sense for white to go opposite the black king because black can then move away. So instead we need to play a waiting move. So the ideal waiting move here is to move the rook along this rank so that we keep the king cut off and as far away from the black king as possible. So I'll play the rook over to a4. It's now black to move. If the black king were to step to the right hand side, suddenly we have the opposition. The white king is opposite, it cuts off these three squares, and we can now deliver a check with the rook, and the black king is forced to step backwards. And we've made progress. We're forcing the king now towards the edge of the board. If I just run it back now a couple of moves, and let's pretend that black didn't play along nicely and move the king opposite the white king like so. Instead, what if black started chasing the white rook again? Well, in this position we can now start following the king with the white king in order to try and gain the opposition the moment that black is forced to move back towards our own king. So if black keeps chasing towards our rook, we keep following with our king. And in this position, when the black king actually attacks the rook, we swing it over to the other side of the board. And now black is going to be forced at some point to come opposite the white king. Let's say they keep running away, we keep following. They're now forced to come back or else give ground towards the edge. Say they come back towards our king. Now we don't follow with our own king because again then the black king can start running away. Instead we play a waiting move with the rook. So we move the rook here to wait to move. Black then either has to run away some more or come opposite the white king. Say they continue running, we continue chasing, and now they're forced to come opposite, and suddenly we can check and drive the king backwards down the board. And if we just run it back for a couple of moves to this position, if for some reason the black king didn't come opposite the white king here, and instead they decided to voluntarily give ground, then we can now use our rook to cut off the space that black has voluntarily given. So we move the rook down the board one square, and suddenly we're cutting off this rank now, and we're making progress towards the edge of the board. So I'll just play through a few sample moves now to finish this position. Let's say that black starts moving towards the white rook again. White then brings the king in. Black keeps coming. White follows. Black now attacks the white rook, so white swings it away from the king. Black continues running. White follows. Once the kings are opposite each other, white now gives the check with the rook. Black is forced to give ground. White follows. Here the king doesn't step opposite because otherwise the black king could keep running away. Instead, white plays a waiting move with the rook. Black runs one square to the side. White follows, and black is then forced back. We give a check, and now black is forced to the back edge of the board, which is what we've been aiming for. White keeps following. Black is approaching the white rook, so white swings the rook away. Black keeps running away. White follows. And then we reach this final position. The white king is opposite the black king, and checkmate can then be delivered. In this video, we're going to cover how to checkmate with the queen and king. This is one of the simpler checkmates. The main thing you have to be careful of here is to avoid stalemating the enemy king. It's simpler than the rook and king checkmate, a checkmate which I did cover in another video, and I'll link on screen with the card above now. But it does still take some know-how to make sure you get it done the right way. So in this position, it's white to move, and the key concept to remember here is we want to keep the queen a knight step away from the black king at all times. So in this position, white can play queen into e4 here, and by doing so we're now cutting the space here along this diagonal, and we're cutting the space here down this file. So because we've moved it into that knight's hop away distance, it's the optimal square for then cutting space from the black king. It's now black to move. Let's say, for example, the black king runs away this way. What we now want to do with the white queen is copy the movement of the black king. So black took a step diagonally forward here, so we will now take a step diagonally across with the white queen in the same direction. So by making that step across here, we maintain the knight's hop relationship, and we once again cut the space from the black king along the diagonal and along the file here. It's black to move. Again, they're restricted in what they can do. Maybe they step backwards because they want to try and stay along this file and stay off the back edge. Again, we can then follow forwards with the queen here to keep cutting off the space. Black moves again, white comes again. Maybe black now retreats into the corner. And this is where we now need to be careful. So here, black has taken a backward step into the corner, but we don't follow with the white queen, because if we were to now follow here and maintain this knight's hop relationship, suddenly we've turned the position into a draw by stalemate, because the black king now has no squares that it can legally move to. So going back a move, in this position here, white should actually sidestep one space to the right so that we do keep the king boxed in, but we still leave it with an escape square from the corner. So the rule to remember here is that if your opponent steps into the corner, you don't follow with the queen to maintain that knight's hop relationship, because otherwise it will be stalemate. So once they step into the corner, you then cut off the space but one square further behind from where you would usually do so. So black can now move his king up the board, there's no stalemate, and this is where we now bring in the king as the white player. Black can only go back and forth, white keeps coming. And once we get to here, we're now in a position to give a checkmate with the queen and king, because the king is now supporting this checkmating square on g7. So black has moved into the corner and the queen can now jump in and deliver checkmate. In this video, we're going to look at how to convert on a king and pawn versus king endgame. The first thing to understand about this endgame is that you must lead the way down the board with your king. So I've often heard this described as the horse leading the cart. If we imagine that the king is the horse and the pawn is the cart, then the horse needs to lead the cart down the board towards the queening square. Black, for his part, is going to do everything he can to stand in the way of that, and so the black king will always be in front of the white king, looking to block progress. And this brings us on to the second key concept about this endgame, which is what's known as the opposition. So in this position we can see that the two kings are standing opposite each other here, and the three squares between them are mutually controlled by both of the kings. Therefore, whichever side has to move now is going to be forced to give ground on this key file which is leading the way to the queening square. In this instance, it's black to move. So if we imagine that black sidesteps one square to the right, black now is controlling these three squares, and so white is now able to make progress down the board by moving diagonally up and across by one square. Black, for his part, now may take a side step back in order to put the king on the file that's blocking the pawn again. And this is where we have a critical position and a decision point for white. There's one correct way to play here, and there's one incorrect way to play here. So if you want to have a think about what you would play in this position in order to play the correct move, then I'd pause the video right now and have a look at it. The incorrect way to play here would be to move the pawn on d2. Whether you move the pawn forward one square or two squares, it doesn't actually matter, it's still an incorrect move. And the reason being, by moving the pawn, you now allow black to take the opposition. So black can now sidestep to the left-hand side, putting the king opposite the white king, and they've taken the opposition. And it's now impossible for white to actually get back the opposition. So let's say white takes a step backwards, black comes in front of the pawn, white now comes to the right-hand side in order to hold on to the pawn. Black can now step backwards again. White can come to the right-hand side to try and make progress up the board. But once again, black steps in front. White can throw in a check here. Black steps in front. And we get this same pattern all the way down the board. Until eventually, we reach this position here, which is stalemate. White is controlling these two squares with the king, and the pawn is controlling these two squares, which means that black is now completely boxed in and it's stalemate. And it's important to show this position not just so you understand how it can go wrong for white, but also so you understand how to make the draw with black. If we now run it back to this critical position, This is where the key concept of the king leading the way really kicks in. So here, instead of advancing the pawn, white should instead move his king and keep the opposition. So white can come one square to the right hand side here, and once again they've taken the opposition. Black now has to give ground in one way or another, so we'll move them to the side. And this is where white can now step to the opposite flank, and we're making steady progress down the board. If the black king tries to come down here, then we can move the pawn forward and give a check, at which point they'll have to retreat. And again, as the white player, we have a decision to make. Do we advance the pawn and check the king, or do we instead move our own king down the board? And this is where we need to fall back on the principles that we've learned earlier, that the king should lead the way down the board. So here, we should move the king down the board in order to maintain the opposition from the side. And again, this is something to remember, that the opposition can apply not just for front-on kings, but also when the kings are side to side like this. By moving the king here, we're now creating a safe passageway through to the queening square. Black now gives ground by coming backwards. Now as the white player, in theory, we continue mirroring the black king, but the problem here is that then black just comes back to where we were, and we can't advance the pawn or else it will be taken. So if we run it back, black's just moved here, we can't advance the pawn, so we would now have to retreat with the white king, and we're back in the position we started from and haven't made progress. So that's why when black moves the king backwards down the board here, now we do advance the pawn by a space in order to actually make progress. Black has to give ground again, and once again, one move leads to a draw, one move leads to a win. Moving the pawn is a draw. Black's now got the opposition over white. Moving the king into d6 is a win. White has the opposition, black is forced to give ground, and white can now step in, and the pawn has a clear run to the queening square. Just to show this finishing out, this is the position we would get. And from here, white can now execute the queen and king checkmate. I have covered that checkmate in another video, which I'll link in a card now. So if you do want to check that out, then follow the card on screen above you. Guys, I hope that video really helps you understand this king and pawn endgame, and you can use it to great effect in your own games. If you have any questions, do let me know down in the comments. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and I hope to see you again in another video.